We're going to start with David Bezanson. David is a land protection strategy director for the Nature Conservancy Texas chapter. David works to acquire preserves and conservation easements statewide for TNC and other land trusts. David formerly served as the first executive director of Texas Land Conservancy, and he is definitely a thinker. He says that you can contact him for inquiries about donating land or conservation easements at the Nature Conservancy. Please welcome David Bezanson.
So as Meg said, I'm the Land Protection Strategy Director for the Nature Conservancy. And basically what that means is I do land acquisition statewide. And I've been doing this for about 15 years. And I gravitate to working on rare plants and rare plant communities. And I'm going to tell y'all why I do that. Does anyone know that plant? A little louder? That's right. Yeah, it is.
Couldn't understand him.
And it's the world begonia. And actually, he's dinging me because this is actually not the right plant for my story. There's Isotria verticillata and there's Isotria medialoides. And this is, I believe, the wrong one. But that's okay. They look pretty much the same. When I was a kid, when I was 10 years old in Nacogdoches, Texas, about 10 or 11, we spent a lot of time in the woods, right? Private property, you know, whatever. And one day when I was wandering around the woods, I think I was by myself that day, I came into a place where the trees looked kind of strange and the shrubs looked kind of strange. And that was as far as my analysis got. I was 10. And there were also some very funny looking plants on kind of a little hill slope. And it really made an impression on me. Hadn't seen anything like that before. We had a plant book at home and I went in and looked at it and it said, this is a rare orchid not found in Texas. That part was not true, exactly. But it might as well be true actually, because it's not going to be found in Texas for much longer. This is a very rare orchid, half a dozen sites, and they're probably going to wink out, you know, unfortunately. And this particular site, not surprisingly, this being Texas, was gone the next year. Somebody built a house on it. The world needed another tract house. But anyway, that experience as much as anything else, I guess. Obviously, I was interested in plants, but that kind of informed me. The idea that you could walk around in your neighborhood, find something rare and unique, made impression. So.
Turn you up just a little bit for the folks online.
So I'm going to start with some basics, which I pretty much always include, but they're important. Texas is very diverse, botanically diverse. Texas has 10 ecoregions, almost 6,000 plants, taxa, and anywhere from 100 to 500 to 1,000 plant communities, depending on how you want to define it. About 20% of which are rare, no matter how you define it. And we have a lot of diversity. And hold on. It's not moving. Maybe because of the
Meg makes it hard on us with the Mac.
Okay. And I think a lot of the reason that I key on plant communities is because I think they're pretty good proxies for the diversity that we have, plant and animal diversity. So I would like to see conservation focus more on plant communities. We have a lot of challenges here in Texas in terms of conservation. We are the #2 state in population, #1 in population growth. There's nothing that's going to stop that or change it. We are number 16 in the acreage, in terms of acreage of parkland, open space, or other conservation land. And as a percentage of our land base, we are 32 out of 50 states. We are way behind all of the other most populous states, California, Florida, New York, way behind. They've got more than 20% of the state is protected in some way or another. With us, it's less than 3%. And that's probably not going to change real fast either, but it actually could be changing slowly because we are seeing more political support for conservation than frankly, I think we've ever seen before in Texas, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, our conservation land is not a lot of, and it's mostly in far west Texas. This map shows that. I show this map every time. And this basically is recycled from my last 5 presentations. So you may have even seen this before, but it never really changes. And that's kind of the point. I don't think I have a lot. Do I have a? Okay. As you can see, most of the conservation land is in a handful of places. You've got the Edwards Aquifer here. You've got Devil's River here, the mountains of West Texas, the Gulf Coast. That's about it. Huge swaths of the state, which I will be talking about in a minute, do not really have a lot of conservation. And that is obviously where a lot of our diversity is. This is the same map shown by county, and it shows you that it's pretty uneven. There's not a lot of equity across particularly regions like the Panhandle and the Plains, where we have virtually no public land. We have very little conservation on the ground. Again, better in West Texas, pretty good, actually about 10%. And then on the coast, there's been quite a lot of conservation, which is of course very heavily driven by wildlife. And this map actually looks a lot like that other map in terms of where the color is, but it's a totally different map. This is actually where the rare plants are in Texas by county, and not plant communities, but that's similar as well. You can see again, the Trans-Pecos is pretty diverse. The Edwards Plateau, especially the Southern Edwards, that's the valley, of course, which is about to be wall-to-wall houses and everything else, but there's a lot of rare plants down there, and the big thicket. Any questions, by the way, about any of these slides? I'm going kind of fast. Yeah, sure. Okay, a lot. I think it's about the plant communities and the landscapes. In fact, it would be nice to think that it's the other way around, that the conservation is driven by the diversity. That would not be true, but it would be, it would be nice. I think people do key on scenic areas, and scenic areas do have a lot of diversity, but I'll get more into that. Yeah.
Does this include city-owned parklands that are set aside for conservation?
It does. It actually includes everything. That 3% includes state, local, municipal, county, federal. Yeah. This one, well, that's Travis, and that is an example of looking under the light, because Travis is probably not actually more diverse than the other counties around it, but it's got a whole lot more botanists, some of whom are in this room. Comal, Bayer, Bandera, Kerr, and Real, and Uvalde. So, that probably is real because those areas are more rugged. They've got the cool canyons, incised canyons. So you do have endemic taxa out there.
Just a quick request.
Sure.
Questions for the online.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. That may not have made a lot of sense for y'all online, but speaking of cool canyons, so this slide is about what communities are the rarest, and I don't have room on one slide for the rarest plant communities, but these are good examples of the ones that are obviously very key. They do have a lot of diversity with them, and they're all also very compelling for conservation, I think, and that's why that's the connection that I always like to make. Just running through these briefly: Sable Palm Groves. Maybe y'all have been to the Sable Palm Grove, Audubon, not TNC, but it's a beautiful place. One of my favorite places in Texas. The Valley, the Lower Rio Grande Valley, the big tooth lost maples of Edwards Plateau, West Texas Cienegas, which is a place where we have done a lot of work, TNC, the Blackland and Fayette prairies, Sylvius dropseed prairies, gamagrass prairies, in short, prairies. Unfortunately, conserving these things is not very easy to do, and I'll be giving you some examples of that. Some of the many problems are lack of funding, and again, that could be getting a little bit better. We'll see. You are limited by willing sellers, whatever you do, And in a state which is 97% private, that matters. Limited by land prices. We average about 20 real estate transactions a year, but they're getting smaller. And that's because the ticket is getting much, much higher for land in Texas every year, particularly since the pandemic and other problems. And that is my segue into, how many of y'all are familiar with the Smiley Woodfin Prairie? How many of y'all have been there? Yeah. Well, you can go there. It's by the highway. And even if you don't set foot on it, you can look at the historical marker. It is the largest remnant of a particular kind of prairie, which was what I just mentioned, the Sylvius dropseed prairie. And this is a plant community which occurs only in Texas. So a little bit of Texas pride there. It occurs only in about 8 or 9 counties in Texas. And this is the largest one left, and it's less than 2,000 acres. So this is a plant community that is not merely rare, but heading toward extinct. So the Sylvius dropseed prairies occur only in a belt of counties northeast of Dallas. Paris, Texas is the largest town in the area. The reason that they're special is because the soils are a little different up there. The rainfall is a little higher. So, you know, it's not 100% different from your Blackland prairie, but the species are mostly different because the soils are different and because the rainfall's, you know, significantly higher. It's like 50 inches a year instead of 30, and or almost. And so you have a completely different mix of wildflowers and grasses in these prairies. So much so that actually Bammert has marketed in the past a seed mix, which is called Smiley Woodfin seed, and it comes off of this property. That was before the property was leased for a solar development. 1,600 acres of prairie, pristine, some additional degraded. So in all, about 2,000 acres. Formerly owned by the Woodfin family, they cut it for hay every year, which the landowners have been doing for 100 years plus. And as y'all know, I think from native prairies, experience with native prairies, those are the prairies that are really good at this point, is the ones that were used for hay production, because they would cut once, or in this case, twice a year, but that would not, and it takes biomass off the site, obviously, but it does not interfere with the you know, renewal of the species, particularly if it's done in the right season. And so those hay meadows are the best prairies we've got. Usually they're pretty small because you know, that was just a part of the operation. But in this case, it was the whole thing, and they would get a lot of hay off of it. Unfortunately, the Woodfin family sold the property, and it was bought by another individual who almost immediately leased it to a company called Ørsted, which is European. They're Danish, and this was one of their first onshore projects. They came in with plans for a giant solar park on the property. Now, we were not aware of this at the time. And obviously it's strictly nobody's business but theirs. It's a private landowner doing a transaction with a private company. Nothing you can do about that. A lot of money to be made from solar. So they leased the property, and we didn't find out about it until the property was already under lease. We, of course, had known about the property forever. And probably it would have ended there. The chapter would have closed, except for, and this is usually the way things happen in the world. I had a friend who had a friend, and her friend worked for Ørsted, the solar company in Austin. And so I managed to get a lunch with them, and it was a very friendly lunch because it was a good restaurant, and the appetizer was great. And we talked about South by Southwest and traffic and ice, you know, things that people talk about in Austin. And then over the entree, I brought up the fact that they had leased the most important environmentally sensitive property in East Texas. And they were like, thank you. And then we had the entree, and then they were like, well, we'll get back to you. And I tried to soften it. I said, I'm elevating this not because I'm trying to be obnoxious, but because this really is one of a kind. And is there anything that can be done? And it was for them an interesting problem. As it turned out, they are a very environmentally responsible company in their homeland. They're new to these shores, but back in Europe, companies have to do all kinds of strange things that they don't have to do here, like make environmental pledges. And they had made a pledge at home that they were going to have a net positive effect on biodiversity. Now, and a lot of companies have like a net carbon positive pledge, which obviously they don't need to worry about. But yeah, the net biodiversity thing was new to me. And this was obviously going to be a major hit. I don't know, if that alone would have been enough, but the Washington Post ran an article in March of 2022, which was beautifully written and really did the best job I've ever seen in journalism of explaining our issues, particularly in native prairie conservation. I mean, it was a big picture, went deep, got all the details right, talked about the private landowner rights issue, talked about the history of the prairie, and it, there was no arguing with it. It was just a very powerfully argued article. And toward the end of last year, my discussions with Ørsted reached the point where they said, we're not going to proceed with this project unless part of the prairie gets conserved. And then the rest was our people talking to their people, and that took about 6 months. But anyway, 1 acre, no, it could have been, but it's going to be about 950 acres. So not everything. More than half. And when I was talking to the local newspaper, when they did the story, when we finally came made it public, they were asking some pesky questions like, well, can you see the solar panels? And I was like, well, I don't know. You'll be able to see the solar panels. I mean, we're going to do a setback, but anyway, 950 acres is no slouch. In the context of prairie conservation, it would be arguably the largest protected prairie in Texas, which is sad, but it's true. You can quibble about it because obviously our Clymer Meadow Preserve, TNC's Clymer Meadow Preserve, which is a different kind of prairie. It's a blackland prairie, but it's a little larger than 950 acres, but it's not all native prairie. So anyway, without getting into the weeds, I think Ørsted can make the claim that they are perhaps doing the most charitable gesture for conservation of this prairie type that has ever been done. And as you can see, it's beautiful, right? I mean, like all native prairies, there are times of the year when it looks kind of like a pasture, but in spring, in fall, it looks like that. The diversity is off the charts, animal and plant diversity. These are some more pictures of Sylvius dropseed prairies. These are different sites. And this slide is actually kind of a victory lap because Sylvius dropseed prairies are actually one of the few rare plant communities where we've really gotten some conservation traction. And I'm proud to say we have been able to do a lot. The Ørsted 950 acres, of course, obviously is not yet real. It is anticipated. We're hoping to have that done by the end of the year. Daphne Prairie, have to mention BF Hicks. This was a private landowner who donated a conservation easement on the only other really large example of this plant community. The Temple family, 100-acre Sylvius dropseed prairie. I worked with Mr. Temple back in 2019. And then these two are pictures from the Talbot Prairie, which is owned by the Native Prairies Association of Texas, and is another beautiful remnant of this type. And I've worked with them on conserving that. Any questions about Sylvius dropseed prairies? Uh-huh.
The Milwaukee Prairie down in Missouri County has dominated Sylvius dropseed. When you say Sylvius dropseed prairie, are you only not prairie as predominant of that graph, or because of the typical soil type and area of Texas?
Yeah, so the question was talking about a prairie site, a coastal prairie site, the Mawatney Prairie, which is a TNC site. And it does have a lot of sylvius dropseed. And because the soil is somewhat similar, sylvius dropseed is associated with sandier and loamier soils, alpha sols. And so as you get into that, as you go east in Texas, you do start getting it. You do not see it in the Blackland prairies. I would say, though, that that's a different type. When you're talking about plant community, there's no scientific definition. I was lucky enough early in my career to be able to have a lot of arguments about this with people like Mr. Bill Carr. But the reality is the plant community is more than just the indicator species, as you know. And so when I say sylvius dropseed prairies, I'm kind of talking about the North Texas ones, which have Trident strictus, still, Spirobla sylvianus, and a few other things that you don't see on the coast, particularly. But you are right. Oh, no. I'm dead in the water again. Yeah, thanks. All right, well, I'm going to move on and talk about a couple of other conservation projects that I've been working on last couple of years, which are plant community oriented. And again, this is what I do because I really feel that it's a great approach to conservation. This property was another victory lap. We closed this one in April of last year, 485 acres in Starr County. If y'all are familiar with Starr County, it's way down there. It's Roma, Rio Grande City. And it's got just a crazy amount of botanical diversity, which comes across from Mexico. And this property has 10 rare plants. It actually has more than 10. It has at least 10 SGCN plants. And it's got 3 or 4 federally listed species. I say 4 because it's got 3 that are listed now and 1 that used to be. So this property is loaded. There's also just a crazy amount of cacti down there. There's 16 cactus species on the property, about half of which are rare. So sometimes properties down there don't look like much, but when you get down there and you start digging around, the diversity is amazing. Again, it is soil driven. The plant community, if you want to define it, it's really about soils, geology, very unusual geology down there. This property took like almost 5 years to acquire, because as I mentioned, federal funding is almost impossible to deal with. This one also had a big slug of private funding needed as match. The Valley Land Fund was awesome. They took the title to this property. I also worked with the Cactus Conservation Institute on this, and really proud of this one. Some of these species have never been conserved anywhere before. This is the only site as conservation site, as far as I know, for prostrate milkweed, which is now federally listed species. And mention briefly one other project that I'm real happy about. And the reason that I'm happy about this one is because it was my college roommate's family ranch. And it's a great story. We would go out there and swim in the river, swim in the creek in college, high school, college, and run around in his Volkswagen thing and barbecue and do whatever people do. And it was just an amazing place. And then he died in his 30s, which was obviously a shock. And I figured that chapter was closed. And then about 2 years after that, somebody called me out of the blue, who turned out to be his stepbrother, and said, we've been talking with the other family members, and we want to do something called a conservation easement. And I was like, you don't know me, but I know your ranch, and I'll do anything to help you save it. And so, it's an awesome ranch too, by the way, and I'll just show you a couple pictures. Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah, places like that are not usually open to the public. It has a run it back. It has a not a particularly large set of springs, but a very consistent set of springs. And it's far enough west in the hill country that it hasn't been tapped out. And so the flow of Montel Creek is very constant. The aquatic fauna is awesome. And it does have two rare plants. It's got the Texas grease bush, which doesn't sound like much and doesn't look like much, but is one of the rarest plants in Texas. It's only in 2 counties, and it's on this property. And then the Texas shrimp plant, which is not quite as rare, but which is kind of interesting because it basically looks like a shrimp plant, which everybody in San Antonio has in their yards. But this is a weird one that lives in wild in Texas, in South Texas, and only occurs in a few places, scattered around. And the largest population is actually on Montel Creek. So it's in Uvalde County, but it's in the Edwards Plateau, so it's pretty far up. You know, it's really more like Edwards County, Real County. It's also got caves, it's got archaeological significance. It's just an amazing property. And now it's under a conservation easement forever. So a few takeaways from what I do. It's not always clear because you see or hear about these things after the fact, and there's a lot of drama that happens before you get to that point. They are real estate transactions at the end of the day, and we all have done those, and they're not very fun. But these are even harder, and because really you're dealing not only with a seller and a buyer, but you're also dealing with a funder usually. And we don't have a lot of funding for conservation in Texas, obviously. And so the funders that we do have, have us where they want us. And there's a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through with most of these programs. They need to be streamlined. They need to be improved. We're talking about federal programs like NRCS, Fish and Wildlife. There's also state money, but not enough. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's not very equitably doled out across the state. The Hill Country has been very fortunate. The Panhandle, not so much. We need more of that. We need more funding. And we have, at the moment, currently some causes for hope on that front, which I will leave you with. And the first item has actually nothing to do with conservation funding, but I threw it in because of the Orsted thing. There is a bill that just got introduced into the legislature in the Senate that would establish a regulatory framework for wind and solar. It's been dropped by Senator Kolkhorst. I don't know whether it will move, because you never know with the legislature whether anything will move. But it's a bold bill. It's not perfect in my assessment, but I think it's got some very good elements, and it would have perhaps prevented or at least deterred what Orsted got into with the Smiley Woodfin Prairie. That said, it's not perfect. The Senator Kolkhorst has also, and actually I'm going to ask for a round of applause on this in advance. Senator Kolkhorst and Justin Holland on the House side are in this final discussion to introduce a bill which would create a large permanent endowment for state park and conservation easement funding in the state of Texas. So that's a big darn deal. The price tag is going to start at $200 billion. And the most interesting thing about this is that the governor and the lieutenant governor are actually out in front on the issue. Yeah, I heard a few gasps from the audience. Governor Abbott, I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago at the Park Centennial event, offered the strongest support for parkland acquisition that any governor of Texas has ever, as far as I know, offered. A lot of that was inspired by the sale of a property over in East Texas that was a state park, but it's a property that parks Fairfield Lake. Yeah, it's gone. I mean, it's a leased property. We don't own it, but so nothing can really be done. It's kind of like it's private property, but at the same time, things like that, especially when they hit at a certain time when people are already kind of receptive to the message, can really catalyze I think, public awareness. And the governor, the lieutenant governor, were the chairman of the Parks and Wildlife Commission, Beaver, Applin. They are some very prominent and very thoughtful people who have realized that we can't afford to keep losing our state parks, and we actually need more state parks. So that's a game changer. Potentially, a lot remains to be done. That would have to be a obviously the bill's got to get passed. It would have to be a constitutional amendment. The voters approve it, and then we figure out how it works. But at least there's hope. There's also a lot of federal money coming through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act from last year, and it's more or less traditional programs to like the Farm Bill, but it's additional monies. And then some of y'all may have heard of RAWA. Have y'all heard of that? The Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It is not real at the moment. It was almost real though, because it came very close to being passed in December of last year as part of the omnibus, and fell apart at the last minute because of the pay for, and now they've got another pay for. But anyway, that bill would make available federal revenue for wildlife conservation, with the focus on exactly what I'm talking about, non-game, because there are programs for the animals that people like to hunt, ducks, etc. Not as much for the non-game species like the whorled begonias of the world. In the meantime, I'm working slowly on co-authoring a book about native plant communities, because as I've said before several times, probably many times already today, I think that plant communities are a great way to look at conservation and focus conservation. And this book will do that. It's going to have a lot of nice pictures taken by Mr. Matt Buckingham. My other co-authors are Jason Singhurst and Amy Truer-Kuhn, who will keep me honest, as I'm not a botanist, and they are. But anyway, I don't know when, how long books take, but we've got a manuscript finished, and I want input from all of you. We want input from all of you. We are looking for editorial advice. We are looking for photographs of plant communities in Texas. The book is going to describe all the plant communities, not just the rare ones, but we'll obviously focus on the rare ones because that's what we really need where we need to focus our dollars. If we get RAWA, if we get state park funding, if we get more money from the legislature, we need to use it to buy and protect some of the special places like Smiley Woodfin Prairie before it's too late. Thank you.
Have you ever considered reaching out to the Texas Municipal League about approaching cities on bond funding for parkland? I'm the chair of the City of Denton Bond Committee. We set aside $3 million and have bought parkland. A lot of that is just for preservation. And so that's another funding source that maybe is not being realized or utilized to the extent that it could be, and just something to consider.
Yeah, the question is, how much we collaborated with municipalities on conservation initiatives, and that's a really great point. Obviously, there are a lot of municipalities, and we have not, kind of to your point, I think, looked at doing it in a coordinated way, outreach, conservation goals. So it's just been kind of here and there and around. Some municipalities have, however, been extremely important for conservation in Texas. Some of the Metroplex communities have fantastic park systems, and going back a long ways, actually, I'll mention City of Garland and the Spring Creek Forest, which is one of the best examples of that plant community, the chalk forest up there. And that's municipal property. And of course, Austin and San Antonio have set aside large amounts of land for golden chief warblers primarily, and for Edwards aquifer protection and that kind of thing. But the plants ride along, and so those efforts have had a lot of benefit for plants. So, I think it's a great idea. I would like to do more of that. Show me how. I mean, we should do that and target some of the areas where you have kind of the intersect of communities that have the means to really do some serious land acquisition, and there's resources to protect.
I think most chapters would have enough wherewithal to really at least advocate for that at their local city council level. As the chair, I have to listen to that, and I do. Obviously motivated too, but I think there's a lot of people who want to see that now, as we see large tracts of housing going up, that really is not what we want to see always. So I would encourage chapters to, hey, go talk to your local municipality and how can we do
Mhm.
more bond funding at the local level to do preservation.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll add to that, municipalities, also counties. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Kendall County voters in November approved $20 million open space bonds for exactly the motivation that you were just talking about, that, you know, they're facing the choice of losing the Kendall County that they know. Yes.
News in the last year, some of these rich business owners like Elon Musk and Bill Gates about huge traffic information. Maybe so much money, my concern.
Well, there's kind of two motivations there. The question is, have we reached out to some of the large private, non-traditional private landowners who are buying large ranches in Texas? And the answer is, it's, you know, we can't always get to them. So it's really more if they come to us. Some of them are just buying for investment purposes, and that's no good. Others, of course, are buying because they want a ranch and they want to manage it, and they tend to be non-traditional, so they tend to be more interested in wildlife than you know, other land uses. So yeah, we have some of those relationships, but I wish we had more. We obviously have some things to offer them in terms of holding conservation easements, but you know, they're all different and they all have their own motivation. Yes.
On with technologies that are less disruptive developments, such as like transparent solar panels. So if you can't preserve the pristine, do you ever have any design with industries to say reducing costs, such as better, yeah.
Oh, I know.
Way to
Take your own cost. Right.
Yeah. So the question is, do we engage? We try to engage with some of these, for example, renewable energy companies through in the policy realm, since we obviously can't buy most of the Smiley Woodfin Prairies in the world. Can we work with them on siting and other things? And the answer is we are trying. We have specifically with renewable siting, we actually have a tool that we're promoting to industry, to anyone who will listen, that talks about where the environmentally sensitive areas to avoid. And the problem is, you know, one at a time, they'll listen to us. On Moss, they really aren't yet. And it's because they're being driven by economics, they're being driven by time. Big picture, solar the decrease of cost of solar panels caught everybody by surprise. And now we're all trying to catch up, use the subsidies that are there before they go away. You know, they're not going to stop and listen to us, unfortunately, much about siting, and that's the experience that we have. But long term, I think there are enough industry leaders like Orsted that are interested in these kind of other ancillary impacts that we will have some effect. So yes and no, and yes and no. Yes.
Are there any real conversations about, and I think this gets back to the conservation movement, but in terms of paying people, like Norway apparently started paying, I think it's not instant at all, just still somebody's in the Amazon, just not to cut, literally making it, this is the economic opportunity for me, which is to not destroy it, period.
Mm-hmm.
Just that by keeping it, and this is more climate related to some extent, just keeping it, sequestering carbon and keeping it an open green space. Are there any real conversations taking place and more along those lines of making it an income for people to not develop and not to not to develop?
Yeah, well, so the question is kind of what is being done to incentivize not converting these habitats to non-native uses, and particularly with a carbon goal in mind. And there's lots of kind of ad hoc efforts going way back. I mean, you mentioned Norway and Brazil, but I mean, we obviously, TNC was involved in debt forgiveness projects down there in Brazil back in the 1980s or 1990s. So I mean, it's not a new idea, but it's ad hoc. It's volunteer. There's still really not a functional market. I think we're getting closer. It's obviously going to be the future, but we do have to have. I don't know if we have to have a carbon tax, but we're going to have a functional carbon market for those kinds of things to have regulatory certainty. At the moment, there are subsidies that landowners are enjoying, but it's not really based on a market price or a functional market. And so that's the future, but it's not the present. And I guess the other problem with that is that it's one thing to pay people to not convert to not, plow the whole thing, and another thing to pay them to actually protect a native plant community. And so that kind of additive protection, I'm not sure if carbon gets us all the way there. It probably will be carbon and a bunch of other things. Yes.
I heard Michael Easton say that he was worried about identifying where the rare plants are because people will come in and dig them up. Has that been a problem? I thought about that with the rare plant side.
Yes, the question is it a problem that we're aware of these sites where rare plants occur because of the threat of poaching? And it is, and yeah, it's totally a problem. I mean, Michael's right. I had kind of hesitated to even say as much as I did about that site in the valley, but you notice I didn't actually tell you where it was. So it's a problem, and it's a problem on that site because, and actually the biggest problem down there is peyote. That's not quite as rare as some of the others, but it's rare enough, and people come and dig it up wherever they can find it. So yes, it's a huge problem, particularly with some of the cacti. Yes.
Hi, these are questions from the online community.
Please.
I got some of them. So,
Okay.
So question number one is what is being done to manage and protect from invasive plants once the properties are purchased?
Well, protecting from invasive plants, and Charlotte's going to talk about this in a little while, is completely futile and impossible, and resistance is useless. But if you're talking about, at the site specific level, then yeah, I mean, we have to. You can't have a native plant community if you have any of these couple of dozen bad actors in it. And almost every one of the plant communities that I've mentioned is threatened by one or the others. I mean, I'll just mention very quickly ligustrums, old world blue stems, buffalo grass, guinea grass. Anyway, I'll stop. But I mean, those things are existential threats to all of the sites that I've mentioned. So while we've got breath in our bodies, I mean, we've got to try to fight them.
Next question is, what are the House and or Senate bill numbers for the state park bills so we can contact all of these?
Okay, I don't have them handy. And the state park bill is not actually introduced yet. So we'll follow up with that.
Great. The next one is, has Green Acres done anything with the Dallas County Open Space Program?
We have, yes and no. The Dallas County Open Space Program is one of the better local preserve systems programs in the state, and goes back a ways. And we were involved when they were acquiring some of their land open space land back again. I think it was in the 1980s, the Ned Fritz era, but lately not directly. But we have an office in Dallas. We have a staff person in Dallas, and we are try to be engaged in whatever's going on up there, because it's very important to also protect urban conservation land up there. And prairie is a big part of that. I mean, some of the nicest little native prairie remnants that you can see are on city land in Dallas County.
And that's all our online questions. Thank you.
Okay. Were there any other questions? Yes.
When you talk about prairie and realistically, how small can it be and be conserved?
Well, there's no magic answer to that, because, well, an acre is pretty small. But, I mean, it kind of depends on what you're trying to conserve. And with prairie, it's multi-purpose, right? I mean, you have pollinators, you have, use by, and we really don't frankly know enough about how important what benefit pollinators, migratory monarchs particularly, can get from very small postage stamps. But in the absence of good data, I would err on the side of caution and say that you can probably get some biodiversity benefit with an acre. The problem is just the resilience of an acre is not very good. And when you have KR in the neighborhood or whatever it is, fighting it is hard no matter what the scale. But so I don't know, that was a very good answer, but there's not really a very good answer. I mean, I guess the other thing to say is that the largest remnants are only 25, 50 to 100 acres, with the exception of the few that I mentioned. So, don't think that something is too small for the Nature Conservancy, because if it's a prairie, that, all bets are off. Yeah. Yes.
When I drive around anywhere, I see publicly owned by the city or the highway department or particularly municipal parks. And the thinking about all of it is grass has been planted and grass is mowed. And I said to myself, all these things are small spaces, but a lot of them, at least in my mind, could be postage stamps that do something to help out native plants. Are there any successful programs, answers? Can you just talk about what can be done to, for instance, influence city parks to quit trying to plant grass in places that clearly have mud puddles in them or whatever, and aren't useful, trying to be artificial grass, I mean, it's real grass turf, but not native.
Well, and so the question is, what can be done kind of in the context of smaller properties that are owned by municipal parks to promote native plants? And the answer is a whole lot. As I said, earlier, you kind of have, unless you can work across the board, you kind of have to work locally, case by case. And that's true of whatever. It's also true of TxDOT or anyone else you're going to work with. But the reality is, most of us don't have a lot of credibility at the national level. We have our credibility in our neighborhoods. And so that's fine. What you want to do is and this organization is the most powerful, potentially, organization in that space, because you're everywhere. You've got members. You contribute sweat equity. I think a lot can be done. I think the enemy is ignorance. 99.9999% of people don't know the difference between Bermuda grass and native grass or KR. And so there's a lot of land out there. A lot could be done to propagate natives. A lot has been done in some places. I'll mention in particular the work that Jaime with us and other partners are doing in Houston with pocket prairies on public land. They've had an amazing impact, and they've had an amazing amount of visibility. And a lot more people know what native prairie is now in Houston than they did 10 years ago, because they can see it. And frankly, most people in Texas have never seen a native prairie, and because there's so few, and you can't blame them for not appreciating it because they don't know what it is. Yes.
All nonprofit in Austin that maintains nature preserve near the Roy G. Guerrero's city park. And I just want to say, there is in the city of Austin, there's an urban forest grant program that we have benefited from. And over the past, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, we've been able to use some of that to put in native plants and trees actually in the park that border on a nature reserve, which we do probably own. It's been a kind of a struggle working with the city parks department. In terms, I want to be diplomatic, but in terms of getting them to stop mowing, we have a project right now that's on the edge of the park where we had to cordon it off because it was like almost impossible to get them to stop mowing it. But that's an area where we are doing research now, and also it took like 2 years for my boss to get permission to put in this little rain garden right by the entrance where precipitation was building up. And it's there now, but like, they're not supposed to mow it and they've already like mowed it twice or something. So it's just kind of a challenge, you know, to do it, but I think there's a kind of a more, there's a more awareness, but it still needs to be made more aware of, and the concept of rewilding parks is now starting to become something that people know about. But just know that our ecology action is working in that area of the city. There's a lot of programs that you probably people just don't even know about.
Yeah. So, and the comment was about the urban forest program at City of Austin and reintroducing natives at the open space. And the only thing I'll say on that is that there are, you know, sometimes native propagation isn't the most expensive thing in the world, and there are a lot of programs and potential partners that you can work with. Getting people not to mow is really, really hard. But cities own a lot more land than you would think. You know, if anybody's read the Robert Moses book, Caro book about Robert Moses, you know, his enterprise was going out and finding all this land that the city owned that it didn't know that it owned, and convincing the city fathers to turn it over into parkland. And there is so much, I think of Houston in particular, with all that West Side land, there is so much land that is not being used for parks, but is city owned, that there's a lot of potential there. Yes.
Indigenous communities, urban communities, to identify and confirm those kind of communities that we need.
So the question is, what have we done to work with the indigenous communities in Texas and elsewhere? And I'll mainly talk about the elsewhere because, you know, frankly, tribal lands in Texas have a very small footprint. There's only 3 recognized tribes. They own very little land. And I'm very proud to say that we actually work very closely with one of them, the Alabama Coushatta in the big thicket of Southeast Texas. We are working with them on prescribed burning and longleaf pine savanna management restoration, and then they come and help us out. It's really cool. But we also, this is a major priority of the Nature Conservancy elsewhere. In Texas, we're somewhat limited, but I will end with a story about the property the Starr County property that I already mentioned. One of our potential funders for that effort was the Comanche Nation. And that didn't end up working out, but just because they went with a different project. But they were interested in conserving the property because some of the cacti species, including the peyote, are I guess the word is sacred to them. I mean, they value those resources, and we're interested in contributing to their preservation. Yes.
I just want to say I do a lot of stuff trying to preserve parks. Some of the North Texas, it's horrible, in Dallas County, and you've got to go down. You got to contact your council member. You've got to go to the city council meetings, and just getting your community rallying. It's just not enough, and trying to get them not to mow. It's a part, and so people just don't understand that. You know, they don't understand native plant, and you can start by putting in like small gardens that educate, right? We all know this, but really more so, you've got to go down to City Hall. You've got to.
Yeah.
It's so difficult. It's only up.
And you've got to convey it in ways that people understand. That, you know, there are landscaped areas, there's parkland, and then there's areas where we're trying to restore native communities like native prairies, and you have to do it one at a time, but there's a lot of success in Dallas and Houston. So, and I think I'm being waved off. So thank you very much. I'm around.